Hello, hello, it's me again, and we are back with Rachel. The last video was an introduction to Rachel, and so now I'm going to read to you a little bit out of all the women of the Bible. And we left off where Jacob was sent away to his father's people, so back to Laban, where Rebecca actually came from. And in today's age, we think of, marrying your cousin as a very negative thing, incest and all of that. But back in Bible times, that was almost preferred because it meant like bloodlines were pure. And you have to remember too that they were living in the land of Canaan, but it wasn't given to God's people yet. So there were a lot of pagans in this area, and they didn't want their boys to take pagan women, Jacob and Rebecca. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Isaac. It's been a long day. I'm sorry. Isaac and Rebecca did not want their boys, Jacob and Esau, to marry pagan women. And unfortunately, if you're reading along, Esau did marry pagan women, and it did burden his mother and his father, and it brought a lot of trouble upon him. And so I believe we're reading 29 through 35 in Genesis. So that's where you'll find this story. So let's jump right into it. No more backstory here. The woman in whom romance and tragedy were blended is the title for this section on Rachel. And you can read more about her from Ruth 4:11, 1 Samuel 10:2, Jeremiah 31:15, and Matthew 2:18. Her name means, or the name meaning is this section. Rachel was the first person in the Bible to have a proper name derived from the brute creation. Wilkinson remarks that, for the most part, the formation of a human name from that of an animal is traceable to some peculiarity, either observed or desired in an individual, which would thus be most intelligently expressed in a rude and simple age. Rachel, the name of Jacob's beloved wife, means ewe, E-W-E, employed more or less as a title of endearment, just as the word lamb is among ourselves. Laban, accustomed to tenderly nursing the weak ewes as they were born, thought ewe to be a fitting name for his second daughter. So like a ewe lamb, a newborn baby lamb. Family connections. Rachel was the daughter of Laban, the son of Bethuel, and Rebekah's brother. Rachel became the second wife of her cousin Jacob and the mother of his two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Now I'm not sure if we will see Joseph again in any of the other stories coming up. I think we cover Potiphar's wife, but that might be a different study that I was thinking of. But essentially, Joseph became the lineage through which Jesus came. And he was the dreamer. He was the one that wore the coat of many colors. His brothers sold him into slavery. So that's the Joseph we're talking about here. As we have already shown, the characteristic feature of the Bible in pairing certain individuals, compelling us to compare and contrast the lives they lived together, makes it difficult to separate any couple and deal exclusively with one or the other. Invariably, as in the instance of Leah and Rachel, their lives were lived out in close association. Yet we must try and isolate Rachel from her sister, for the galaxy of the Bible's famous women would be incomplete without such a star. Surely the much-loved wife of Jacob and mother of Joseph, Israel's savior, and also Benjamin, could not have been an ordinary woman, even though she shone with reflected glory. From the many references to Rachel, we have the following facts of her life and character. So our next woman, or daughter of grace, in our book is actually Leah. So we'll be talking a little bit about Leah with Rachel because they were sisters and because they were sister wives. But this is going to be a study focusing mostly on Rachel. She was naturally beautiful. It would seem as if Rachel had all the loveliness of her aunt Rebecca. The sacred record speaks of her as a beautiful and well-favored or attractive woman. Her sister Leah was tender-eyed, meaning some form of eye blemish, making her less appealing than Rachel, who possessed Jacob physically. Seeing her in all her natural charm and beauty, Jacob loved her. Although beauty may be only skin deep, it nevertheless wins admiration. The Hebrew form of Rachel's description, Genesis 29:17, suggests that she was beautiful in form and beautiful in look. That God does not look upon the outward appearance merely is evidenced by the fact of which Ellicott reminds us that it was not Rachel, with her fair face and well-proportioned figure, and her husband's lasting love, that was the mother of the progenitor of the Messiah, but the weary-eyed Leah. She was divinely guided, while as the young daughter it was Rachel's task to go to the well and draw water for her father's sheep. It was no mere coincidence that she went that day when Jacob arrived. She might have been sick or indisposed, and if Leah had had to go for the water that day, what a different story might have been written of Jacob, as well as the history of Israel. Fleeing from his home to Haran, Jacob met God at Bethel and left it lifting up his feet, Genesis 29:1. He implying a lighthearted alacrity as he continued his journey with the divine promise in his heart. That's that story of when he slept on a stone as a pillow and he had the dream with the ladder that went to heaven. That's the divine assurance. Thus, with the assurance of the divine presence and guidance as a guarantee of favor and safety, he met the shepherds who told Jacob of Rachel, Genesis 29:6, the name that was to charm his heart the rest of his life. That meeting between Jacob and Rachel was of God, and it was his providence that ordered the first glimpse of each other at the well. We are apt to forget that often the most seemingly ordinary incidents in life are as much of the divine plan as the smallest parts of a watch, and upon these smallest parts of the plan, all the others depend. Our steps, when ordered by the Lord, lead to great issues. As far as Jacob and Rachel were concerned, that meeting was unforeseen and unpremeditated. A divinely directed life is often shaped by circumstances that human presence could not have foreseen. As soon as they met, it was love at first sight, at least with Jacob. The first sight of his cousin's beautiful face and figure cast a spell over him, and he kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. As she was his cousin, Jacob was not prevented from kissing Rachel by the etiquette of the East, which was the home of warm feelings and demonstrative actions. Probably the tears Jacob shed were those of gratitude to God in bringing him to his mother's relatives, and also tears of joy because he knew instinctively that the lovely maiden he kissed would be his wife. Jacob removed the stone from the mouth of the well, helped Rachel water the flock, acquainted her with his story, and was taken home by an excited Rachel, where he was hospitably welcomed. George Matheson draws our attention to the interesting fact that the meeting of Jacob and Rachel is the first courtship in the Bible growing out of a cousinly relationship. In other words, as having its roots in a previous friendship. Jacob, a poet by nature, dazzled by Rachel's beauty, broke out into a deep love before marriage, a thought to ponder in these days when young people are being told that premarital experiences are quite in order, to test whether they are suited for each other. Jacob was to prove that the typical trial of love is waiting, and he had to wait many a year before the one whom he loved, as soon as he saw her, became his wife. She was deeply loved. That's the next section. Oh, hold on. Sorry. We are distinctly told that Jacob loved Rachel, and that the 7 years he served Laban for his daughter seemed to hit him seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Genesis 29:18 and 20. So Jacob had to work for 7 years before he could marry Rachel. To him, it flew by because he loved her. Even after Jacob found that he had been deceived by Laban and had been given Leah instead, he served and waited for Rachel another 7 years because he loved her more than Leah. 29:30. From the first moment Jacob saw Rachel, he loved her, and she became his choice as a wife. But while she alone was in the heart of her lover, the real choice was not Jacob's, but God's, and for the first place, God had chosen Leah. In his second marriage, Rachel only received half of Jacob. The other half had been given to her rival sister. While Leah might have had the keys of Jacob's house, Rachel had the keys of his heart. Leah seemed to have influenced his judgment. Rachel never ceased to hold his love. Leah bore Jacob 6 stalwart sons. Rachel was the mother of only 2, but the sons of Rachel were dearer to him than the sons of Leah. Jacob is outstanding among the male lovers in the Bible for the true, romantic, abiding love he bore for Rachel. Whether such a deep and ardent love was reciprocated, we are not told. The Bible has no reference to Rachel's love for Jacob. She appears as a somewhat placid character. We have no record of any grief she felt or protest she made when she discovered how Leah had taken the first place in Jacob's life. We would like to believe that Rachel's love for Jacob was as romantic as his was for her, and that also the years she had to wait for him seemed but a few days, because of her heart's affection for Jacob. She was cruelly deceived. The deceit perpetuated by Laban upon Jacob, Leah, and Rachel adds color to the record. Laban cunningly beguiled Jacob into marriage with Rachel's elder sister and less beautiful sister. Jacob had accepted Laban's terms to take no wages for his labor in his fields, and at the end of the 7 years waiting, expected to receive Rachel. In the gloom, the bride appears closely veiled, according to custom. The ceremony is performed, and the waited pair return to their bridal chamber. But in the light of early morning, Jacob discovers Laban's duplicity, a duplicity in which Leah must have had a part. How shocked Jacob must have been to behold the plain-looking, undesired Leah instead of the face of his dearest Rachel. Leah, by her father's deceit, had stolen her sister's blessing. That sounds familiar. Isaac had blessed Jacob, believing him to be Esau, and now Jacob marries Leah, believing her to be Rachel. In the moment of his surprised discovery, did Jacob remember how he had stolen his brother's birthright by covering himself with a hairy skin and venison smell and making himself appear as Esau? Was this retributive providence for his own deception of his blind and dying father? I would like to think so. Laban condoned his unrighteous act by declaring that in those times the younger daughter should not be given in marriage before the firstborn. He should have told Jacob this when he covenanted to serve the first 7 years for Rachel, or before the marriage. Anyhow, I think about that a little bit. Sorry, I'm going off script here. I think about that a little bit, and 7 years is a long time. Maybe Laban thought surely Leah would be married off by then, right? But as they approached the 7-year mark and she hadn't been married off, I do think a conversation with Jacob should have been had. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. Okay, where were we? Jacob then became involved in 2 marriages, which were not deemed unfitting in an age when polygamy was tolerated even by godly men. For another 7 years, Jacob toiled bravely on. True love enabled him to persevere until Rachel was his. What interests us is the absence of any recorded protest on Rachel's part against her father's deception. Why did she not cry out when she saw that Leah, instead of herself, was being given to Jacob? If Rachel had resentment at the hour of marital vows between Jacob and Leah, she must have suppressed it. Why was she so placid amid such a calamity, at least for the man who loved her so deeply? Unmurmuringly, she goes on, waiting for another 7 years, ere she is able to share Jacob with the woman who by that time had borne him many children. Perhaps the deep, unchanging love Jacob had for Rachel found little echo from her own heart. She was lamentably, but not finally, barren. Once Rachel became Jacob's second wife, her continued barrenness created an unreasonable and impatient fretfulness within her soul. Seeing Leah's many happy children made her jealous. What anguish is wrapped up in the phrase, "but Rachel was barren"? Genesis 29:31. Says Donald Davidson, Rachel would taunt Leah on not having the love of her husband, while Leah would find revenge in the childlessness of her rival. Rachel's whole being was bound up in the desire to become a mother, so she cried to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." Genesis 31. Rachel should have cried to God instead of Jacob, whose anger was kindled against her for her impossible request. Certainly he loved Rachel with a true and tender love, and indignation because of her must have been a source of bitterness. He should have thought of the bitterness of Rachel's disappointment and quietly pointed out to her the withholdings of providence. Poor, childless Rachel was not forgotten by the Lord, for he remembered her and opened her womb. 22 through 24. She gave birth to a son and thereby took away her reproach. The grateful mother became a prophetess, for she called her baby Joseph, which means "the Lord shall add to me another son," which was not merely the language of desire, but the prediction of a seer. Of all the children of Jacob, Joseph became the godliest and greatest. Renowned as the Savior of Israel, he stands out as the most perfect type in the Bible of him who was born of woman to become the Savior of the world. She was secretly idolatrous. The time had come for Laban and Jacob to part. While Laban had learned by experience that he had been blessed for Jacob's sake, the patriarch likewise had been blessed, and with his wives, children, and rich possessions, found he could no longer live at Haran. So he set out for his old home, and took with him all that God had given him. Laban was loath to lose the diligent partner who had worked with him so faithfully for 20 years. While Laban was absent for a few days, caring for his many sheep, Jacob gathered all his family, cattle, and possessions, and secretly left. Returning home and finding Jacob gone, Laban set out to overtake the travelers. Catching up with them, Laban took Jacob to task, not only for leaving so secretly, but also for stealing some of his household goods and gods. Lowercase g, of course. It was this accusation that revealed Rachel, lovely as she was, in an unloving light. Although the wife of the heir to God's promises, she evidently was a secret believer in old heathen superstitions. She stole the household gods, and when Laban sought for them among the goods of Jacob, she had them hid beneath her person. There we go. In her cunning, in hiding the small images in human form used for divination, and which had a religious significance, Judges 17:5, 18:14, 17, 18, and 20, Rachel manifested something of her father's duplicity. It was not until Jacob reached memorable Bethel that he buried those strange idols under the oak at Shechem. Those lifeless deities, the size of a miniature doll, were regarded as indispensable evidence as to the rights and privileges of family ownership. Hence Laban's query, "Wherefore hast thou stolen my gods?" 31:30. Because of his superstitious beliefs, Rachel likely stole the gods to ensure a prosperous journey. Such relics from the old home would guarantee all continuance of the old good fortune. Jacob's trust was in the great God at the top of a ladder, and its ascending and descending angels. But Rachel wanted humbler gods that she could see. Further, those household divinities suggest the laxity of true worship in the home. Thus, although living in a polygamous state maritally, Rachel was also guilty of religious polygamy. There was a professed relationship to the God of Israel, yet at the same time she was married to idols. Chapter 30, 23 and 24. Rachel had no right to carry away what was not her own. Had she known that those stolen images would become a terrible snare in Jacob's family, perhaps she would not have taken them. 35, 1 through 5. Images and relics have always been dangerous elements in connection with true religious worship. How prone the human heart is to forsake the spiritual for the material, the unseen for the seen and temporal. May ours be the constant desire to obey the apostolic injunction to keep ourselves from idols. 1 John 5:21. She was tragically taken. We now come to a feature peculiar of Rachel as a mother. Hers is the first recorded instance in the Bible of death in childbirth, and her sepulchral pillar is the first on record in the Bible. It would seem as if Rachel had surrendered her idolatry before the death stroke fell on her. The hallowing influences of divine blessing on her husband and his seed as the result of Bethel begot within her a sense of divine awareness. Young Joseph's great reverence for God bespeaks of Rachel's godly training in his young boyhood years. Jacob's love for her and his stronger faith, chapter 35, 2 through 4, helped to purify her character, and she lived on long after her death in the life of her noble son. While Jacob and his host were on the way from Bethel to Ephrath, tragedy overtook Jacob when Rachel died in giving birth to her second son, Benjamin. Chapter 35:16. She had named her first son Joseph, meaning the Lord shall add to me another son, which prediction was fulfilled when Benjamin was born. How often the brightest anticipations of life are clouded by the gloom of the grave. Rachel prayed for children, but the beginning of her second son's life was the end of her own. What travail and anguish are resident in the phrase, Rachel travailed and she had hard labor. She died. Genesis 35:16 and 18. Facing death, she called her son Benani, meaning son of sorrow. Suffering had brought her to the gates of death, and the gift she coveted provided to be a crushing burden under which she sank. But Jacob chose another name for their child and called him Benjamin, signifying the son of the right hand, and showered much affection upon the motherless child. The last cry Rachel uttered as she died was Benani, son of sorrow, and it is in the spirit of this Benani that the Bible portrays Rachel. When Jacob came